Okay, we're going to go back to the screenshot here in order to discuss consonant manner, which is a little bit more complicated than some of the other phonetic dimensions we've been dealing with so far. And this is in part because languages tend to split up consonant manner into fairly complex natural classes in terms of how consonants pattern in the phonology. We'll see some of this later this semester. And correspondingly, the theory of distinctive features for consonant manner ends up being a little bit more complicated to reflect that empirical complexity. Now, cross-linguistically, we find some sort of intricate natural classes of consonants, and we need a feature theory that reflects that. So what do we have here? Well, here are all the major consonant manners listed on the horizontal here, and we're going to be using these 5 features. And there's one more that we're not going to include in here but might become relevant later in the semester. These 5 are enough to get all of the manners of consonant we've been dealing with in here. So stops, remember, are made by completely stopping airflow through the oral cavity and then eventually releasing it. Fricatives are made with a closure in the oral cavity that's narrow enough to cause turbulent, noisy frication, but not narrow enough to completely stop the airflow. Affricates are these sort of strange double segments that start as stops and end as fricatives. We're not really going to deal with affricates in terms of feature theory this semester. We're going to treat them exactly like stops when they pop up in our problem sets. Next semester, if you take advanced phonology, we'll talk more about the differences between stops and affricates, which are pretty subtle and phonologically complicated. So for right now, affricates are going to be treated just like stops. Nasals are sounds that are made usually with complete oral constriction, just like a stop. These are sometimes called nasal stops, right? But you couple the oral and nasal cavities, and so there's no turbulent, noisy airflow, no turbulent noise associated with these segments, because even when the constriction is released, you don't get a lot of air rushing out of the oral cavity. Instead, it's coming out of the nasal cavity. Right? Liquids are sonorous approximant segments that don't have any obvious vowel counterparts. They often involve sort of complex secondary articulations, and they're definitely not obstruents. They don't have noise associated with them. They only have sonorous voiced energy and formant structure. Glides are also approximants. These are like the consonantal counterparts of vowels. In particular, the glides y and w are basically the consonant counterparts of the vowels e and u. And then, of course, vowels are the most sonorous and the least consonantal kinds of sounds in the world's languages. So these are all manners of consonants except for vowels, which are manners, which is a separate manner. But we can treat vowels as having all of the same manner features as consonants with different values for those features. How is this going to work? We have the feature syllabic, and this is meant to encode the difference between a segment that's the head or the nucleus of a syllable versus one that isn't. So vowels are going to be plus syllabic. If we buy into the theory of syllabic consonants in English, then it would also appear to be the case that nasals and liquids can sometimes be plus syllabic. In general, I'm usually not going to be using syllabic consonants in this class. I'll usually be thinking about those syllabic consonants as being basically sequences of a schwa followed by a consonant. But if you wanted to say that n or ul can be syllabic in English, you would mark them as plus syllabic in just those contexts where you get the syllabic versions. This feature consonantal is a little bit different than the syllabic feature, and in particular, it's used to distinguish between glides and every other kind of consonant. And so what we would say is that consonantal is the feature that's maybe associated with some kind of significant constriction somewhere in the oral cavity. Glides and vowels really don't have any kind of significant constriction, whereas other consonants do. Okay. Sonorant is the feature that encodes the absence of noise, the absence of turbulent, noisy airflow. And so the opposite of sonorant is obstruent. Stops, fricatives, and affricates are obstruents. They're minus sonorant. And that's because they create turbulent, noisy airflow, and you can hear this as acoustic noise. So sounds like t, s, f, k, ch. These are all noisy sounds. They're obstruent sounds, and they're minus sonorant segments that don't have a significant enough constriction to produce turbulent, noisy airflow, or that don't actually include a noise component, like nasals, are plus sonorant. So nasals, liquids, glides, and vowels all are lacking a significant noise component, and so they're all plus sonorant. Nasal feature, pretty straightforward. It means that your velum is lowered, the oral and nasal cavities are coupled together, and you're getting nasal airflow. So nasal stops as consonants are going to be plus nasal. Vowels here are marked as minus nasal. We'll see a little bit later in this class, there are also nasal vowels. Those would be plus nasal, not significant for the phonology of English for the most part, but again, if you had a vowel that was nasalized, you might want to mark it plus nasal instead of minus. All of these other consonants, which are oral consonants, are going to be minus nasal. And this last one, continuant, is sort of interestingly different than all the other features here. And this is one where airflow through the oral cavity is completely blocked at some point during the consonant. So that would hold for stops, which involve a complete closure in the oral cavity, but not fricatives, because air is always allowed to flow through the fricative constriction. Affricates have a stop component in them, so they would be minus continuant. Nasals, interestingly, even though they're sonorants, even though you don't get a strong burst or a noise component, they still involve stop articulation, because in a nasal like m or n, you are completely blocking off airflow through the oral cavity. It just doesn't create obstruent noise because the airflow is continuing through the nasal cavity. So nasals are going to be minus continuant. And then liquids, glides, and vowels, like fricatives, are going to be plus continuant because they allow air to continue flowing through the constriction for the entire duration of the segment in question, whereas stops, affricates, and nasals completely block or stop oral airflow for at least part of their durations. So these are what the major features mean and how they map onto consonant manner. Excuse me. These end up being able to recreate our manners of articulation, but it's a little bit complicated about how to do so, so it's going to require some practice, and I have a couple practice problems here. Let's stop for a minute, pause the video, and try to recreate some of these classes. So what's the best way of using distinctive features, or the shortest way to specify just these classes? First, vowels. The answer. Vowels are the plus syllabic sounds in a language, ignoring syllabic consonants for the moment. Obstruents, that is, sounds with significant noise components, stops, fricative, affricates. What's the best way of specifying those? Answer, these are the minus sonorant segments of a language. So obstruents are minus sonorants. What about consonants including glides? Answer, all of the consonants including glides are minus syllabic. You can't use the consonantal feature here because that marks glides as different from other consonants. That's directly relevant to the next one here. All of the consonants except for glides. How would you specify that using distinctive features? Answer, these are all of the plus consonantal segments, right? So accepting glides and accepting vowels. How would you get fricatives? Answer here, this one's kind of complicated. So the thing that distinguishes fricatives from sonorant consonants is that they're obstruents, they're minus sonorant. But then we still need to distinguish them from stops and affricates, which we're treating as the same in this system. What's the difference between a stop and a fricative? The feature continuant. So we need both here. To get fricatives, we need minus sonorant plus continuant. That's how we specify a fricative in this particular theory of distinctive features. What about oral stops, so not including nasals? Answer, well, just like fricatives, these are obstruents, and just like fricatives, they need to be distinguished from other obstruents, and so it's the continuant feature, again, that's going to distinguish these two. And again, we're treating stops and affricates as the same here, so this feature combination, which is going to be minus sonorant minus continuant, that's going to single out stops and affricates, not just stops. If we need a feature later that will distinguish stops from affricates, we'll make one up. But for right now, we're not going to need one. Note, if we wanted to also include nasals in this, we want to do stops and nasals, right, we would just drop the sonorant feature and say that stops, affricates, and nasals are all of the minus continuant segments. So there's different ways of specifying different natural classes of consonant manner, including single manners like just stops or just fricatives. And it's a little bit more complicated than the other dimensions we're discussing here, and that's because the phonological patterning of consonant manners is a little bit more complex and intricate and interesting than it is for other kinds of features.